Hey, so I'm Andy Revoking. I'm here at ProPublica's offices down in Tribeca, New York City, with Jessica Wentz from Columbia University's Sabin Climate Law Center.
Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School.
Right, and Jessica runs their invaluable Climate Deregulation Tracker. It's kind of unfortunate that we need such a thing these days. That launched in January, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm, correct.
And it's a very helpful tool for anyone who's trying to figure out and keep track of this multifaceted strategy that the Trump administration is getting into gear today, more so than ever, to push back on, devolve, unravel President Obama's 8 years of climate policies and rules, which are sort of woven into the fabric of more than a dozen agencies, really almost 20 when you really count carefully. And so it's a tough process of unraveling that. President Trump right now is heading over to the EPA, the headquarters of the Environmental Protection Agency, checking out his new acquisition, his new real estate acquisition, and making some points about he's going to release his executive orders that have been in the works for, well, since December, really. And we're going to discuss a little bit, give you a bit of a sort of tour of what to look for as the news unfolds and the Twitter feed explodes in the next few hours. And so, Jessica, I thought I'd start with you just sort of giving a sense of your, as an environmental lawyer, trying to keep track. What's the main thing you're on your list? What's your kind of key? What's got you either freaked out the most or most tuned in?
So I would say, just generally speaking, I'm extremely alarmed by the message that Trump is going to be sending with this executive order to the American public and the rest of the world, which is that the federal government here in the U.S. is not going to take any action to address the causes of impacts of climate change, and instead is planning to dismantle the actions that have been already taken. In terms of the specific elements of the order, what we can expect to see, I think that the directive to dismantle and rewrite the Clean Power Plan is definitely the biggest and most alarming piece, because that was such an important part of the Obama administration strategy to cut back on greenhouse gas emissions. But there's also a variety of other regulatory directives, as well as the rescission of executive orders, that are also alarming. And I think just as a whole package, it's really quite frightening.
The Clean Power Plan is particularly tricky because it's already paralyzed in court, right? So it's kind of like a two tracks for being challenged. How does that relate to what you try to understand?
Yeah, so we don't know what to expect from the court in terms of its review of the Clean Power Plan. But it's pretty clear that this executive order from the Trump administration is probably going to direct the Department of Justice to ask the court to put that case on hold while they review and rewrite the emissions guidelines for existing power plants. We don't know whether or not the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which is currently reviewing the legal merits of the rule, will actually grant that request. If they don't grant the Trump administration's request, then they'll probably go ahead and issue an actual decision on the merits of the rule, and then the case will be appealed to the Supreme Court, even if the Trump administration withdraws its defense, because there's a lot of other states and environmental groups that are also interested and have standing to defend this rule in court.
And he's already made some moves on the transportation front, on cars.
Yes. So basically, the Obama administration issued vehicle emission standards back in 2012. And when it first issued those standards, it said that it was going to do a midterm review around 2016, 2017 to see if those standards needed to be revised for motor vehicles in future years. And the Obama administration did an evaluation, did a very comprehensive review, and it concluded that there was no justifiable reason for revising the standards. The facts were still there. It still made sense to impose those standards. And recently, the Trump administration said that it was going to reverse course on that. It was going to reinitiate this midterm evaluation. And I think we all are expecting that the outcome of that will be potentially less stringent standards will be issued for future model year vehicles.
On a press call last night, a Trump official said the order will not include anything specifically targeted at the Paris Agreement on climate change. I notice on the feed here, we have quite a few watchers right now who are in places like Saudi Arabia and elsewhere around the world. So in thinking about that, one thing I wrote about on ProPublica early on was that perhaps and this wouldn't be in this basket of orders, the most powerful, harmful thing he could do to blunt global progress is to turn off the money for UN programs under the Framework Convention. There had been a pledge of, I think, $3 billion toward this Green Climate Fund. Obama tried to sneak as much of that money out the door as he could before he left office, but it's pretty clear that there's not going to be new money there. And that's kind of one of these issues where for a lot of developing countries, they're less concerned, frankly, about the arithmetic on emissions than they are on the arithmetic on money flows. And I don't know whether you would agree that that's kind of, so it's the stuff that isn't in this package that's coming out today that might be the most important.
Yeah, I agree that would be absolutely detrimental. We've been the largest contributor, or at least we've pledged the most amount of money to the Green Climate Fund. And to pull out of that, we would be, basically pulling out of providing money for clean energy projects and adaptation projects, which are going to be sorely needed in many developing countries. And while that is apparently missing from this executive order, budget proposal did call for a termination of all funding to the UNFCCC and to international climate funds. And so that's clearly on his agenda. During a press briefing last night, the White House spokesperson refused to talk about what the plan was with respect to the Paris Agreement and international climate funding, but we do at least know from the budget proposal what they're aiming to do with those funds.
So there's a question here from David Jokin, watching in Finland. Thank you for being out there, David. And he says, I was quite shocked when watching live the North American Arctic building a vision for regional collaboration. This was a recent Wilson Center presentation. He said there seemed to be hardly any discussion with regards to Arctic global warming. And he wondered, what's the issue here? Actually, this comes up today in terms of one of the presidential memorandums from President Obama that Trump is going to be undoing today is about, it came out in September, and I wrote about it in the text alongside our Facebook Live video here. You can look for the link. The issue is that the President Obama had several different memoranda and directives that had said that national security implications of climate change have to be considered going forward. Again, across about 19 agencies, he wanted this plan to go forward, and Trump is basically pulling the plug on that. Now, I've written a ton about the Arctic. I've been to the Arctic 4 times, and one of the clearest impacts of global warming, even now, is the reduced sea ice in the Arctic, more open water. There are structures there. There's the Arctic Council. Countries with Arctic territory already are kind of engaged with each other. But to just sort of pull the plug on this directive without at least saying we have to revisit it, maybe rewrite it, seems like, whatever you think about policies on emissions of greenhouse gases, the implications of the changes that are underway on the planet seem pretty profound already.
Yeah, I was disappointed to hear that the executive order apparently is going to call for the revoking of those executive orders aimed at promoting resilience and adaptation to climate change in federal agencies.
Right, nationally and internationally.
Yeah. And it doesn't quite fit with the rest of his deregulatory agenda, because these directives, and there were also directives calling for energy efficiency at federal agencies. Right. These directives were going to save taxpayers money in the long term, and they didn't impose any sort of regulatory burden on private parties. So it doesn't fit within the deregulatory agenda. It really just seems like an anti-climate change action agenda that we're seeing.
Yeah, and without a lot of, it seems almost as if it's been looked at as a caricatured issue, as opposed to being a complex reality with lots of questions about how do you approach policy. But, and that's what's bothersome. There's this throwing out the baby in the bathwater kind of thing. And also, I wrote on ProPublica a couple of weeks ago, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, in his confirmation hearing, and his private comments, responses to senators, reflected a pretty profound understanding that the climate system poses lots of risks that relate to national security. Yeah. And that just echoes, and I have links here on Facebook, a lot of existing Defense Department directives that say the same thing, going back through actually 2 Bush administrations and Clinton administration and Obama administration. So again, this is one I would like to think that there's going to be some point when this need to just, in a sort of cartoonish way, undo things that, as he pledged in his campaign, to a more nuanced approach. But I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah, I mean, eventually it's going to be impossible to ignore those impacts, but at that point, it's going to be too late to address them effectively. So.
The Deregulation Tracker in a minute, but I see some really good questions here. Jeremy Churison, I'm wondering, in terms of market forces and more aggressive subnational action, we could see a more aggressive transition with or without the U.S. federal government. In other words, what are the extra governmental forces that are already in play here?
Yeah.
The stuff beyond climate law.
So I've seen conflicting information about sort of where the market will go in the absence of federal regulation and the extent to which coal may or may not have a resurgence. I don't think that Trump can make good on his promise to bring coal back entirely. I mean, it's being displaced by natural gas simply due to the economics of natural gas being cheaper. But in terms of subnational action, states acting, I mean, we can certainly expect to see continued efforts on the part of states like California. But even here in New York, we've had a very difficult time getting any sort of climate change legislation passed. The House of Representatives passed a climate change action bill last year, but then it got stalled in the New York State Senate, and it never even made it onto the floor of the Senate because the committee was chaired by someone who doesn't believe in climate change and was slightly more Republicans than Democrats on the committee that didn't want to take action on climate change here in New York State. So point being, we can't even get climate change legislation books on the books here in New York State, and I wouldn't expect to see much in many other states that are perhaps less inclined to pursue their own environmental regulation. So, yeah. I mean, yeah, we'll have a state-by-state piecemeal approach. Some local governments will be taking under very concerted efforts, but it's just not going to be enough. Without federal guidance, it's just not enough.
And a lot of this relates to those out years. Through like 2020, many states, including many states that are fighting the Clean Power Plan in court, were already on track to meet its terms. But then it's about how to maintain the momentum to have the harder targets hit later in the next decade and beyond is the kind of thing that you lose. If you lose momentum in these incremental ways, that can really harm that long-term picture.
Yeah.
And this relates to things, Energy Department R&D budgets. We'll talk about budgets in a minute too. Budgets is the other stealth way to slow things down. Jeff DeBelko at the Ohio University, who used to be at the Wilson Center, and I think he's in class right now teaching. He said, "We're watching from the heart of coal country, where many voters took seriously the promise to bring coal jobs back. Mechanization, cheap natural gas appear to make that a very hard promise to keep. How much of today's announcements will actually make a difference?" Now, one of them is about ending Obama's restriction on coal leases on federal land. But again, those, as I've read in the more specialized coverage, coal leases only have value if there's a market. Yeah. It's not like you can force companies to bid up on something when the natural gas and/or more efficient economy are heading in the other direction.
Yeah, and the federal government had really slowed down on the issuance of new federal coal leases even before the moratorium was issued. So, yeah, it's really unclear that this will bring many coal jobs back. And another point I'll just make is that in the press briefing on this executive order, they were saying that this is going to create jobs and kill job-killing regulations. But that's not consistent with what the EPA and other agencies found when they conducted very in-depth analysis of the economic and job impacts of these regulations. Things like the Clean Power Plan, some jobs would have been lost in the fossil fuel sector, but more would have been created in the clean energy and energy efficiency sectors.
Right, but out on the campaign hustings, that can be a hard argument to make.
Yeah.
When it's a state-by-state battle.
Yes,
and I think that's where Hillary Clinton's campaign, when you look carefully, it was hard. They didn't come up with a strategy to counter those hard realities in states like Ohio.
Yeah.
There's more questions here, but I want to get back to the tracker for a minute. So tell me, how did this come about, and how do you do deregulation tracking?
All right, so we wanted to make sure that somebody was very closely monitoring all of the different actions undertaken to dismantle the pretty big set of climate change regulations and programs that had been initiated during the Obama administration. And so we decided to do that. We wanted to not only track these developments, but also provide the public with links to relevant resources and information about opportunities to comment on regulatory developments as they arise. And we also wanted to provide some context for the landscape in which all of these changes are occurring. And so our Climate Deregulation Tracker links back to a database that we compiled of all the climate change regulations that are out there. And so every time a deregulatory action occurs, it links through to information about the regulation that's being affected. And we're also compiling information about public health benefits, economic benefits that we are going to lose as a result of these deregulatory actions. And we keep it updated just by monitoring every single day new developments. We track congressional developments as well as executive actions. So things like proposals to amend the Clean Power Plan to provide for to prevent EPA from regulating greenhouse gas emissions I'm sorry, I said amend the Clean Power Plan.
Mm-hmm.
I meant to say there was a proposal to amend the Clean Air Act to specify that greenhouse gas emissions are not air pollutants that can be regulated under the Clean Air Act. We're also monitoring executive actions, any regulatory actions that will be undertaken, including the regulations that are going to be issued following and in accordance with this executive order. And we'll be monitoring things like the budget proposal and what happens in the end with the budget. So lots of stuff.
And by the way, at ProPublica here, we have a team, a growing team, monitoring these same things in a reportorial way. And we're eager for people to get in touch with us from within government, outside government, from farm states, from coal states, to help us tell the story of the realities that lie behind climate policy fights, and budgets. Circling back to budgets, which I mentioned a minute ago, and this relates to so many of the agencies. If you kill the EPA's budgetary capacity to do oversight or to work with states, that's going to be a harmful thing. This is an interesting question where we'll have to see as the skinny budget moves toward being reconciled with a real budget, what Republicans who are more mainstream will hold out for, while those at the hard right push for, again, zeroing out things. There was some coverage on one news outlet a couple of days ago about infighting within the Republican apparatus at EPA, emerging at EPA, among the beachhead team and others, over how hard to go and what to cut. The same thing is going to be true at NOAA, the agencies that monitor the climate system, NASA as well. So budget's another thing. Budget tracker is another thing that someone needs to be doing. Although if you go to nasawatch.com or EPA, there's inside EPA, there's lots of good information flowing from in those agencies. And the Trump administration is trying to clamp down on leakers,
yeah.
which makes it even that much more important for you to get in touch with us or people at Columbia University as well. There's more questions here, and I wanted to go through a couple of other points. Here's a good one related to what we were just talking about. Janet Lee Burnett asks, have there been programs and projects within the USDA Forest Service that were poised to deal with impacts of climate change, i.e. changes in planting zones, shifts in invasive species, shifts in mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects? Will this new order have a negative impact on those programs and ideas? Just want to fill them in on a couple of things. Again, this is an area where budgets matter. And it's not just within this order, but there's a national climate assessment that Congress has mandated the government do since 1990 through two Bush administrations, through Clinton and Obama administrations. And there's another round of this national climate impact assessment that's supposed to start happening in the next couple of years. If that gets pulled, and that's not expressly in the order, that can lead to, again, a diminished capacity to understand things like invasive species and or disease-carrying insects and how they relate to what's coming. We've already seen some clampdowns. Centers for Disease Control was going to have a meeting early this year during the transition on health and climate change, and that got canceled in a kind of in a preemptive way. The agency said, well, we better not go there. So these things kind of, it's not just the orders, the express, sorry, it's not just the language in the order, but it's the message from the administration. The White House sets the tone, and that can really have this kind of reverberation even within agencies for a long time to come. Actually, did you want to weigh in on this issue of USDA?
Sure, yeah. I can say that the Forest Service in particular was really at the forefront of agency adaptation efforts when it came to planning for the effects of climate change on the natural resources that our federal government manages. They had even introduced draft guidance for their own environmental reviews of natural resource management plans on how to account for climate change. They had amended their regulations actually long before, I think back in 1990, the Forest Service regulations were amended to provide for considering the effects of climate change when they are going through the process of revising land management plans. So some of this was done in accordance with Obama's executive orders. I'm not sure exactly how Trump's new order will affect what the agency's been doing, other than, as Andy mentioned, sort of setting a tone of, no, you shouldn't be thinking about climate change in any of your activities. And so I would guess that in future resource management plans, we may see less consideration of climate change. The agency probably won't adopt its draft guidance on how to account for climate change in environmental reviews, especially if this executive order rescinds the Council on Environmental Quality broader guidance on accounting for climate change in executive in environmental reviews.
And just to broaden things slightly, the Obama administration on issues like wildfire risk and flood risk, I've written critically about some aspects of how they approach these issues too. Not everything you see out the window that's extreme, that has a climate element is the function of global warming from greenhouse gases. When you look at the prime drivers of hazard, what's actually putting us in harm's way in places like western wildfire zones and most coastal zones, it's still the dominant driver of risk, meaning number of people exposed to a known hazard, is how we're living, where we're building. And there you have this whole other realm of incentives and disincentives, like flood insurance being priced correctly is a big issue. It actually could be one that the Trump administration conceivably could act on. There was a few years back, there was a bipartisan agreement on a bill that ratcheted up the cost of federally funded, federally subsidized flood insurance, so that people would start to actually have to adjust where they choose to build. But what happened then was Democrats and Republicans rebelled once the bill got passed. People said, hey, our insurance is unaffordable, and the whole idea had to be ratcheted back because of the politics. And on wildfire too, Western wildfire, the issues again that are driving exposure to risk are not just climate related. So it's important not to get too focused on that one aspect of these things. And that could have been, in a way, you could have a theory that some of the vulnerability to Obama's policies came from a torquing toward climate change being the element that they stressed in security directives and resilience directives. But that's all kind of in the hypothetical realm, unless some FOIA results in language saying the science is here, but we got to do it this way. So we'll see going forward. Kelly Levin from World Resources Institute has posted a comment here, one of my favorite climate wonks, and I say that, I don't mean that as a negative. What do you see as the biggest consequence of moving away from science-based, fact-based decision-making? Well, you see, and that is, there are all these layers of pondering what we're looking at here. So what do you think about that?
I guess for me, it's the loss of momentum and the potential ramifications even beyond this 4-year period of just reversing course and, as you said, completely departing from science-based, fact-based decision-making. It seemed like it took us a long time to even get to where we were with the Obama administration in terms of tackling the challenges of climate change. And this reversal, of course, could put us on even a long-term trajectory that's really going to delay the action that's needed today.
Yeah, there's things that have gone away that used to be there. The Office of Technology Assessment that the Congress had is no longer there, which was a very helpful nonpartisan enterprise aimed at making sure facts mattered in the science realm. But as we know, and as Jessica kind of implied, facts and politics don't always get together, don't always do well together. And that's not just on science-based issues. Maybe this is a big swing of a pendulum that will swing the other way. There's a March on Science coming up, and later this month, there's hopefully in classrooms around the country, there are good discussions about this post-fact world we seem to be in. And I've written on .earth before I came to ProPublica about can we build a culture in which veracity is cool? It's not just about politics. Until people care about what's real, again, and I think young people could lead the way, perhaps, if they care to, then we could just sort of drive down some long lane of post-factual policy and end up really regretting that.
Yeah.
And which actually this relates really well to a question that came in here from, God, let's see if it's slipped by already. Oh yeah, Stephen Griffith says Donald J. Trump seems to understand the value of Zika research, meaning Zika, the mosquito-borne illness that's so devastating, but does not seem to understand that Zika is a climate change issue as well as a public health issue. It seems this could be an opening to educating the administration. Personally, again, having written about these kinds of issues where you have something that's related to the climate system, whether it's Zika or another illness or insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa that could be because of drought patterns there or because of climate change, there are opportunities there. But one of the things that's required for those opportunities to get engagement is for the White House to actually have a full suite of input. And so far in our reporting here at ProPublica and elsewhere, it seems like there's kind of just a filter bubble around the White House so that only lets in stuff that, well, some of it relates to the president's TV watching habits, only relates to things that the team in the bubble wants to hear. And that could be troubling. People in the intelligence community are really concerned about this with a variety of ideological backgrounds. We're coming toward the end, so I don't know if there's some other points you're hoping to make. Can you just tell people how to find the Deregulation Tracker?
Yeah,
for starters?
Absolutely. So I think for one thing, there's a link in the sidebar to this Facebook live stream, so you can go there. You can also find our website at columbiaclimatelaw.com, pretty easy URL, and from there it's very easy. On our homepage there's a link to the Deregulation Tracker, and we also have a whole bunch of different resources and descriptions of our program areas that are divided into different sections. So if you're curious about a particular aspect of this executive order, things like how will it affect natural resource management, we have a program area for climate change and natural resources. And it's right there on our homepage, columbiaclimatelaw.com.
And there's a great final capping question from Jeremy. Whoops, let me go back to the screen. Jeremy Cherson asks, so let's say we have a very pro-climate candidate elected in office by 2021. How aggressive will it take to catch up? How aggressive will he or she have to be to catch up? And I'll make one point and then give you the last word. One of the first pieces I wrote at ProPublica after I started in December, shortly after the election, stepped back and I tried to remind readers, when you take a big look at this climate question, which is, took us more than 200 years to get locked in on a fossil-fueled form of economy, and it's going to take time to get out of that. This is not a one Trump thing that could be fixed, or one president fix, or one president ruination. It's and by the way, by far the most emissions growth will be coming in developing countries, not here, and the most impacts will be in other countries, not here, because we are insulated by our wealth and technology. So it's a global effort. It will require 100 years, as the Paris Agreement, that was the first element of this long treaty journey that backed away from the idea that you could have sort of a binding targets and timetables, top-down, UN mandated approach with some kind of carbon police running around to a model. The Framework Convention is a model of cooperation, collaboration, trust building. It is iterative by its very structure, and it's 100 years. It articulates for the first time this is a long journey we're on, not some quick fix. It's not like an old environmental problem. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act grew up in a time when an environmental problem was right there. You know, something you could fix. Put a scrubber on a stack or a catalytic converter on a car, and those pollutants went away. CO2 is not like that. So, but getting back to this core question, you know, so what would it take if we have a whiplash back to a green president? Is this post-presidential as well as being post-political in some way?
Well, I agree that it's inevitably going to take a lot of time, and I am not necessarily optimistic about us meeting climate targets like being able to keep warming to 2 degrees. But I do think that if this pro-climate president enters into office, and we have him in 2021, or her, that this president will need to think about developing a strategy for deep decarbonization, getting all the way to carbon neutrality across all sectors. What we had during the Obama administration was a start, but it was incremental, and it didn't address greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors. And so I think the next president who wants to act on climate change is going to need to go further and plan for full carbon neutrality, and also plan for carbon neutrality not just in the United States, but also think even more about how we can support efforts abroad, because as Andy mentioned, most of the emissions growth is expected in developing countries, and developing countries are also going to be experiencing the brunt of the impacts of however much warming we do ultimately incur as a result of our greenhouse gas emissions, and they deserve adaptation assistance to help them deal with those impacts.
Right, and I can't resist, there's one more question. Sarah Sand says the importance of much of this research can be argued through many perspectives and aspects, clean air, energy independence, etc. To what degree do you believe these areas of research could be saved by these other arguments, or will this nuance be ignored? I think this is a really important point. In other words, the science on climate change and on options for dealing with it lays out a whole wide suite of things. From geoengineering, that could be our fix. If we want it to be,
It has to be.
No, well, you know what I mean, or it can be, you know, some kind of heavy top-down control. And because so many different countries are involved, all of these things will be in place. Some country will. China has much more of a top-down control approach, and the United States is much more of a market approach. India is this, as one politician there told me once, a raucous democracy, and you know, it took them 5 weeks just to vote. 1.3 billion people. So it's amazing to think India is so pivotal. But this idea, the science, you know, this circles back to, can science matter? I think if there's a way, we find a way, we being these diverse communities in coal places or clean energy communities, whatever, if we can find a way to have a dialogue that says, okay, here's the science. This is a CO2 molecule. And here's our differences on how to approach it, including doubts about complexity. That's part of, there's social science here too. Then maybe there's some hope of the kind of thing that Sarah was looking for. And and one can still possibly hope, you know, Trump seems dead set to keep all of his campaign promises. And so far he's done that, and most of them have been alarming to environmentalists and, well, people in social and political arenas as well. But he said this about energy, about science. I believe these words came from the Trump campaign when sciencedebate.org asked all the candidates about science. It said the federal government should encourage investment in research and development across the broad landscape of academia. Though there are increasing demands to curtail spending and to balance the federal budget, we must make the commitment to invest in science, engineering, healthcare, and other areas to make the lives of Americans better, safer, and more prosperous. Wow. So I don't know, it's kind of buried there. So, but maybe someone from the Trump campaign will be listening and say, hey, you know, that's one we have to hold up as well. He also said, perhaps, I've never heard Donald Trump use the word perhaps in his speeches, so I'm not sure if you wrote this, but perhaps we should be focused on developing energy sources and power production that alleviates the need for dependence on fossil fuels.
Perhaps.
Perhaps. So thank you very much for tuning in. Please come to propublica.org and keep track of our reporting here. A very special package we did on 400 members of the Trump administration's beachhead team. Lots of ongoing reporting on climate and environmental implications of Trump policies. And remember, Columbia Climate at Twitter and on the web, the Columbia's Sabin Law Center's Climate Action Tracker, Climate Deregulation Tracker.
Yeah.
And thank you for tuning in. I'll be sharing this video when it's posted, so share it with others as well. And we'll try to do this fairly regularly. Take care. Thanks to everyone who came by. Bye-bye.